So I'm a clinical social worker at the Prescott, Arizona Veterans Hospital, and was talking about where the seeds for my work as a PTSD specialist were planted in 2001 when the Twin Towers were hit in New York City. And I was working and living there at the time and made my way through 5 police barricades to volunteer at Ground Zero. So that was a turning point for me where I realized the world was not as I thought it was, and that I needed to reassess my place in it. Several years later, I decided to go back to school specifically to be able to work with veterans suffering from PTSD. During my time at the Albuquerque VA, I had a chance to work with many Navajo and Pueblo veterans, which I very much enjoyed. So when the opportunity to work at the Prescott VA as the rural PTSD provider up in Navajo Nation presented itself, I jumped on it. I just immediately applied and there was no turning back at that point. So next slide, please. So post-traumatic stress disorder has an enormous impact on the lives of those who suffer from it, as well as those who are close to them. It often takes a heavy toll on the body, mind, and soul of the survivor. We used to only associate PTSD with war and combat, right? But we've come to understand that anyone involved in a catastrophic event, such as a car accident, serious illness, or violent crime, can develop PTSD. According to PTSD United, 20% of the adults in the United States who have experienced a traumatic event actually suffer from PTSD. Next slide, please. So it's interesting to note that the prevalence of PTSD among veterans is roughly twice that found in the general population. But if we think about it, that's kind of what we might expect, because being a veteran or being in the military, you are more likely to encounter traumatic situations, much more likely. And the same might be said for people who are firefighters, police officers, first responders, EMT. I don't know what the stats are there, but my guess is they would also have a higher rate of PTSD as well. Studies show that the rate of PTSD among Native American veterans is significantly higher than the population at large. And some of the factors that might contribute to this might include racism, different spiritual and cultural values, and the possible impact of epigenetic or transgenerational trauma, which is a topic I won't get into at this point, but it's very interesting topic. So other minority races such as Hispanic or African Americans may face similar challenges as well. Next slide, please. The important thing to remember is that PTSD is a treatable condition. The thing is, though, that every veteran and every trauma is different. So what works best for one warrior with PTSD may not work as well for another. In other words, if you look at my picture on the right, one therapy does not fit all. Next slide, please. For some veterans with PTSD, a single therapeutic approach, such as cognitive processing therapy or traditional Native American healing, is all that is needed. For other veterans, a combination of therapies is most effective. Each of the VA-endorsed therapies discussed later in this presentation have proven to be powerful tools for healing PTSD. They may be helpful when used individually or in conjunction with other therapeutic tools as needed. And if you look over to the right, I've got a list of possible tools. And what I have an arrow going down to is the PTSD toolbox. So I look at the journey of recovery as starting with learning as much as I can about what's going on with me as a person with PTSD, and then what are the tools available from my PTSD toolbox, and then to start to build that PTSD toolbox. And then learning which tools are going to be most effective for where and when. Next slide, please. So what does PTSD mean? PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Post meaning after, traumatic meaning bodily injury or mental shock, stress, which we all know what that's about, but definition, tension or anxiety, and disorder, a disturbance of the body or mind. Next slide, please. So PTSD is a disturbance of the body or mind that manifests as chronic tension or anxiety after bodily injury or mental shock has occurred. And the key word here is after. So we all, almost everybody experiences some disturbance of the body or mind immediately following a trauma, but it's when it continues down the road, again, chronic and after, the key words here, as chronic tension or anxiety, sometimes long after bodily injury or mental shock has occurred. Next slide, please. Who gets PTSD? Well, we talked about this earlier, right? PTSD can happen to perfectly normal people as a direct result of being in a traumatic situation, such as combat, a car accident, an assault, or dealing with a serious illness like COVID-19. Next slide, please. What are some of the factors that can contribute to the development of PTSD? So I've got a little picture on the right here, and I'm going to go into these factors that are over on this picture in a little more detail. So next slide. The first, and probably pretty obvious to most of us, is the severity of the trauma. So the more severe the trauma, the more likely someone could develop PTSD. So once again, all of these factors that I'm going to be talking about do not mean someone's going to get PTSD, but they may contribute. And usually it's a combination of several of these factors that would contribute to someone developing PTSD. But the severity is an important one. The number of traumas one is exposed to, previous exposure to traumatic events. So if we look at the nervous system as, well, it is one of the 9 major organs of the body. And let's compare that to, say, your skeletal system. The more you bash on your leg, the more likely your leg is to get injured. The nervous system works the same way. The more you hit the nervous system with traumas, the more likely it's going to develop an injury, such as PTSD. The support a person receives before, during, and after the event. Well, this is important as well. And obviously, those of you in the military most of you did not get much support before, during, or after an event, for good reason. If you were in the middle of combat or theater and something happens, you got to move on to the next mission. You got to think about staying alive. You're like moving on, that stuff gets buried. You're taught in boot camp, basically, suck it up and you don't think about it, just move forward. So that stuff gets buried and you didn't receive any support. If you were in Vietnam and came back, that was even more evident when you got stepped off the plane and got called a baby killer and a whole slew of other things. So the next one is the amount of time spent in highly stressful situations. So this kind of going along with the number of traumas one is exposed to, the more time you spend bashing that leg or your nervous system, the more likely it is to get damaged. Next slide, please. The more interesting question to me is why some people get PTSD and others don't, even when subjected to the same situations. Next slide, please. There are other factors that may also contribute to the development of PTSD, which may help explain why some people get PTSD and others don't, even in the same situation. The emotional or physical condition of the person at the time of the trauma. So you have 2 people on guard duty. One person is up there and he has not slept in 48 hours. The other person just came back from leave and he had 3 weeks of hopefully decent sleep, R&R, and ready to sort of face the world again. And suddenly they get hit by oncoming small arms fire, or maybe a mortar attack. The person who has not slept for 48 hours has much less resilience. They're sort of worn dry. There's nothing left there to protect themselves from what is happening. So they are more likely to be impacted by that. Not 100% here, but these are kind of generalizations, general concepts. The suddenness or unexpectedness with which the trauma happened. So let's say we have two warriors. One of them was raised as a kid, 10 years old on the farm, taking life all the time, hunting, killing the chickens for dinner. And it becomes sort of just a natural way for him. And he always wanted to be a warrior. This is what he has prepared for his whole life. And then we've got another young fellow who joined the reserves, never intending to go to war, thinking it would pay for his college education or her college education. And suddenly they step off a plane in Iraq and they get hit with a mortar attack and the person next to them gets blown up. It's like, whoa, where did this come from? They're not as prepared to deal with that and more likely to be impacted by trauma than the person who has been training for it their whole life and ready for it and really joining to experience, to go into that situation. The unique physical and emotional constitution of the person plays a role. So this is important. Sometimes people will look at someone with PTSD and say, oh, you're weak. What's wrong with you? Well, let's take a look at this from the perspective of the 9 major organ systems of the body. And I'm going to disclose a little bit about my own life here to give you an example of this. I just got back my blood work from my physical. My cholesterol, I don't know if you guys know what a normal cholesterol is. It's supposed to be like 200 or below. My cholesterol was 140. I eat whatever I want. My sister's cholesterol was 144. She eats whatever she wants. My brother's cholesterol is roughly around the same. He eats whatever he wants. We don't die of heart attacks in our family. We eat whatever we want. Our circulatory system and the way we are designed doesn't build that stuff up. On the other hand, I'll be honest with you, we have shitty nervous systems in our family. My dad started having panic attacks in his 30s for no known reason. He had to be on Valium his entire life to function and raise 4 kids. But he was very successful. He had 12 patents under his belt, inventions as a scientist at GE. That's the way we were built. You would not look at somebody who had heart failure and go, what a weak person, or diabetes. By the same token, you should not look at someone with PTSD and say the same thing. Their nervous system may just not be built that way. You've heard of the term nerves of steel. Some people can take an enormous amount of stress before that system gets damaged. Other people get damaged very easily, just by their makeup and constitution. The beliefs and values held by a person prior to and after the trauma. Somebody's raised Catholic, thou shalt not kill. They're put in a situation where they are forced to maybe take the lives not only of other soldiers, but possibly women and children by accident or whatever. They might hold on to that and beat themselves up for the rest of their lives thinking they're going to hell. Other people, like that young boy I was talking about who grew up on the farm, taking life and training for that and not seeing a large difference between animals and people. They're all living creatures. It's nothing to, doesn't mean anything. He's able to do it much more easily. So it can play a large role in why someone might develop PTSD. And lastly, the perception of imminent danger. Let's say you're stuck walking through a minefield, 45 minutes, 300 yards, step by step. Let's say You don't know there's mines there. You walk through it and you don't step on anything. Well, it's not going to impact you, even though your life was severely, possibly in danger. You didn't know it, didn't bother you. There might not be any mines in that field, but if you're told that every step of the way you could blow yourself up and you spend the next 45 minutes thinking you're going to die at any moment, that could have a much stronger, well, it's going to have a much bigger impact on you than not knowing there's anything there. So as you can see, there are many reasons that can contribute to why somebody gets PTSD. And also that leads us to the next point, is why we should never judge somebody else's situation. Oh, they only did this, or I only did this. Who knows what that person's background was? Who knows what that person's beliefs was? Who knows what that person experienced? Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at the 4 main symptom groups that define PTSD. How do we know when someone has PTSD? Let's take a look at the first one. Next slide, please. Hyperarousal. That's the body getting jacked up. It's something called the fight, flight, freeze response, adrenaline getting pumped into the body, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But the symptoms manifest as hypervigilance, always on guard, difficulty concentrating. When you're always flooded with anxiety, it's hard to pay attention and concentrate. Panic, fear, anxiety. The converse side of that fight flight, which I just mentioned, is anger, rage, irritability. Simultaneously, when you try to go to bed and your body starts getting hit with adrenaline, hyper aroused, it can be very hard to sleep, especially when we look at our next set of symptoms, which we will in a minute. But I wanted to also mention, sometimes when you get really, really jacked up, you can become very hypersensitive to sounds and noises, so much so that like a pin dropping 3 rooms down can shock your system. Doesn't always happen, and that's when you're really sort of really wired, let's say. Next slide, please. So the second main symptom group is re-experiencing. And that's when the trauma keeps coming back. So before I go into it, I'm just going to explore, talk a little bit about my perception. Why does the trauma keep coming back? Well, the body has a need to understand and process what's going on in a way so that it can file those memories and what happened in the proper places in the mind, not to get rid of them, but so that they can just sort of pull them out when they're needed and put them back when they're not. When we don't process this stuff properly, they just float around and then wait for opportunities to try to process themselves. And why they don't get processed, I will talk about in a minute. But right now, I want to talk about the actual the symptoms of re-experiencing. So nightmares, first and foremost. Reoccurrent or intrusive thoughts about the trauma. Keep coming back, keep thinking about it. Your body reenacting as though the trauma were occurring again. So that's where you start to experience the physiological impact or symptoms that you experienced during the trauma. Heart racing, sweating, muscles tensing up. And then your mind responding the same way. It could be, I'm going to kill this person, or I got to get the hell out of here. And in extreme cases, people have flashbacks. And that's where something triggers a memory of the trauma, and they actually lose track of time, place, perspective, and think they are back in the trauma. Sometimes it comes across as being a blackout because they literally have blacked out everything around them. So I've talked a little bit about why this happens, the body not processing them, but why doesn't the body then later process this stuff? Let's look to the next slide. Actually, it's 2 slides later. Can we go forward and then back up? Because I want to go to that. Keep going, keep going. So avoidance, back up one. Back up one. There we go. There we go. Avoidance. Back it up. Forward. Right there. By the way, we tried to hook this up where I could switch the slides, but once again, technology kept us from doing that. So, Ayla, you're doing a great job. But this wasn't what we had hoped. Avoidance is the reason why we don't end up processing these memories properly. But what are we avoiding? We're avoiding the uncomfortable feelings. It's natural to want to avoid those things. We're avoiding being jacked up all the time, being on guard all the time, not being able to sleep, having nightmares. Sometimes people avoid going to sleep because they don't want to have a nightmare. It makes sense to want to stay away from that stuff. Sometimes people avoid so furiously that they won't even go out of the house. They start staying home all the time because they don't even know what's triggering them. They just know when they go out, they get jacked up. So I am not going anywhere. The problem with avoidance is it never then allows us to process this stuff properly. So avoidance manifests as staying away from triggers, sometimes feeling numb. And feeling numb, by the way, is not a conscious avoidance. Feeling numb happens. The body is taking care of itself by numbing itself to survive. So if you're in combat or theater and you hit one trauma, then another trauma, then another trauma, sometimes the only way you can get through this stuff is by going blank emotionally. Just boom. Problem is, unnumbing yourself is a whole nother issue, and it's much more difficult to do. So you get back, and it takes a lot more work to sort of regain your emotional constitution, so to speak. Losing interest in things is another form of avoidance. Avoiding people, activities, places, or people that are reminders. Specific activities. Sometimes people will avoid going to Muslim restaurants if you've been in Iraq, or any place where you might encounter a Muslim. Or if you're in Vietnam, Asian restaurants, specifically Vietnamese. Avoiding thoughts, feelings, conversations, including avoiding therapy. Well, any therapist knows, any PTSD therapist knows that one of our major challenges is to encourage veterans not to avoid and keep explaining to them why it's so important that they not avoid. The inability to remember parts of the trauma. In some cases, the trauma is so severe that people just black it out. I will share with you, I'm not going to name any names, so I'm not disclosing anything, but a veteran who was in the Tet offensive in Vietnam. I'm not sure if I got that right, but he was actually an accountant and was not trained to do anything, any kind of combat. And when the attack happened, was forced to go out there with a gun and just remembers standing there. And then the next thing he remembers is standing there as everything's exploding. Next thing he remembers is being 2 hours later back in the safety zone after the thing was over, but has no recollection of what transpired in between. So far beyond what he was trained for and his ability to sort of digest what was going on. Another form of avoidance is loss of activities that you used to once enjoy. And of course, one of the major ways of avoiding, but we don't often think of it that way, is using alcohol and substances to help better tolerate the distressful hyperarousal or re-experiencing symptoms. Let's go back to the cognitive distortions. So back 2 slides. So the fourth component, which was added only recently in the last couple of years, are cognitive distortions. So cognitive distortions are the persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself or others or the world, and or the persistent distorted cognitions about cause and consequence of blame of events that lead to blame oneself or others that often occur in the context of PTSD. So let's explore some of those cognitive distortions in a little more detail. So let's go to the next slide. Ayla. So some of the areas that get impacted: trust. Sometimes who we once trusted, we no longer trust. Safety. Where we once felt safe, we no longer feel safe. Esteem. Our self-esteem or esteem for others may diminish, especially when we blame ourselves or others for the trauma. And also, when you are dealing with PTSD, it feels like you've lost, sometimes it feels like you've lost a lot of your former potential of what you could do. And so your esteem gets bashed. I'm not the same, I'm not whole. There's something wrong with me. So our minds get sort of twisted by the trauma, and we stop seeing the world according to how it is, but according to the trauma. So the trauma sort of impacts how we view everything. Next, 2 slides forward, please. So what are the biological components of PTSD? We touched on that briefly when I mentioned the fight, flight, freeze response, but I'll go into it in a little more detail here. All living creatures are hardwired to respond to threats to their survival with the fight, flight, or freeze response. So I've got, if you want to sort of witness this firsthand, just turn on the Nature Channel. And what you will see is the fight, flight, freeze response sort of in full force by observing the antelope, which tends to run. It's sort of predisposed with the flight response. The lion or the cheetah or leopard usually attacks, and it is sort of more imbued, so to speak, with the fight response. And then, of course, the famous opossum, which is known to roll over and play dead in dangerous situations. Next slide, please. So all human beings are sort of imbued with the fight, flight, and freeze response. And some of us are born more prone with the fight response. Some of us are born more with a flight response. Some of us come out of the womb kicking and screaming, and others sort of comatose. That'd be more like the freeze response. But we've got all of that in us. Let's think about what happens when you join the military. What do they start doing in boot camp? They try to beat, literally in some cases, the flight and the freeze response out of you and foster the fight response. Well, that fight response manifests oftentimes as anger, rage, attack. And so what happens when we leave the military and we are triggered or encounter situations that sort of bring out our PTSD symptoms? It's why a lot of veterans experience superficially, more outwardly, the fight, rage, and anger, even though underneath it, I think the flight, the fear response is still there. But and let me just point out that the military does it for good reason, of course, because when you're in a combat zone, you do not want to be freezing or running. You want to be attacking, and you want to do it instinctively. The problem is that when you come away and you're back in civilian life, and that condition is still sort of wired into you, it becomes very difficult sometimes to function. So the flight, fight, or freeze response is caused by the nervous system pumping either adrenaline or noradrenaline into the body after it senses something dangerous is nearby. As I mentioned, it's a natural response to anything the body has been conditioned to sensing as being dangerous. Next slide, please. If the body experiences something dangerous that is overwhelming or extreme enough, the trauma may damage the nervous system, and if there's not sufficient time afterwards to process the information and or heal, its signals can get crossed and later begin to erroneously trigger the fight, flight, freeze response when there is no danger present. Next slide, please. So in other words, PTSD could be looked at as when your body continues to respond to non-threatening situations with a flight, fight, or freeze response after the threatening situation is over. There's no dangerous situation. I kind of like think of that little robot in Star Wars, Danger Will Rogers, Danger Will Rogers. And let's say that little robot gets damaged, and now it starts telling Will Rogers, danger, 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 when there's no danger. Will Rogers is all screwed up. He doesn't know what to get ready for, right? Well, this is what happens with PTSD. Your nervous system goes, danger, Will Rogers, danger, Will Rogers, but there's no danger. And there we are going, what the heck is going on? And we're responding to things, and there's no danger there. So we're all screwed up, and we don't really know how to respond at that point. Next slide, please. Is PTSD a lifetime sentence? Now, this is a good question. In most cases, the answer is no. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So I'm going to read you the stats here. Roughly 80% of persons who complete a trauma-based treatment of cognitive processing therapy or prolonged exposure therapy experience significant improvement in their PTSD. Note, it does not say they've gotten completely well. It says they've experienced a significant improvement. Well, with about 25% of those persons reporting a full recovery. So that's 25% of those 80% actually fully recovered. So for some people, they are completely able to rid themselves of their PTSD. For most people, they are able to make significant improvements, lead healthy, productive lives, and maybe they have to deal with it from time to time. It's interesting to say that roughly 80% of the persons who complete a trauma-based treatment of cognitive processing therapy or prolonged exposure therapy experience significant improvement. What about those other 20%? Well, there's different things going on there, but for many of them, timing is a critical factor. If you start engaging in something like prolonged exposure therapy, when you're not able to tolerate the additional stress that prolonged exposure therapy brings on, then you're not going to see an improvement at that time. In fact, you might actually feel like you get worse. You have to be sort of ready to do it. Your body has to be at a certain point in your recovery before you engage in that. And we're going to talk about the different steps of recovery in a moment. Next slide, please. What are the 3 basic stages of recovery? So Dr. Judith Herman. So who is Dr. Judith Herman? Well, most of us have heard of Sigmund Freud, who's like the father of modern psychology. Well, Judith Herman is like the mother of modern PTSD psychology, at least in my book. That's what I give her credit for. She identifies 3 stages that individuals go through in their recovery from PTSD. So over on the right, stage 1, establishing safety. Stage 2, remembrance and mourning. And that's the processing part that we don't get to do when we're in the military most of the time. And 3 is reconnecting ourselves to the world around us. The outside, the present world, not our PTSD world, which is the world of our trauma that keeps haunting us, but the world currently here. Next slide, please. So healthy coping, what does that mean? Well, it's establishing safety and stability, understanding what's happening. I'm not crazy. It's my body and mind reacting, learning what works, developing healthy coping skills, not drinking myself under the table, knowing when and how to get help. What are my resources? That's why you guys are here, partly to learn about PTSD and figure out what your resources are, gaining trust and support. And as I mentioned, not using drugs and alcohol to tolerate symptoms. Next slide, please. Trauma processing is the second stage. And that's the part I've talked about with the avoidance and sort of what kind of keeps the PTSD ball rolling. It's never being able to deal with the trauma and process it properly so we can file it away. It's like an undigested meal that just sits there, bad meal that just sort of gives you a stomachache that you can't get rid of until you expiate it one way or the other. Understanding my life as a whole, and then acknowledging what was lost and how things are different now. So it's not getting rid of the trauma, by the way. It's not saying, I've got to get rid of this. It's integrating the trauma into my current life and sort of figuring out who am I now with who I was before the trauma happened, who I was after the trauma happened, and what does that make me now? Next slide, please. Did we miss a slide? It should be step 3. And prolonged, yeah. Trauma processing, oh yeah, so cognitive processing, oh, no I didn't. So over on the right here, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, EMDR therapy are 3 evidence-based therapies. And what I mean by evidence-based is they have undergone some, a lot of testing to see how well they work, that the VA endorses for helping one process the trauma. This is stage 2. This is what I was talking about when timing is important. You don't jump into trauma processing if you have not completed step 1, which is stabilization and healthy coping. But when you get through that point, when you successfully sort of go through that stage, then if you would want to continue and actually work through this stuff and try to heal the trauma, that's when you decide to engage in one of these therapies. And let's explore a little bit about what these therapies are. Next slide, please. So cognitive processing therapy. Cognitive processing therapy involves writing about the trauma. It involves daily written homework. It involves examining thoughts, feelings through daily written exercises and in-session review, and can be done individually or in group. So over to the right is an example of a worksheet in cognitive processing therapy. And this is a ABC worksheet, which is a worksheet designed to help us, first of all, identify some of our feelings that are associated with the trauma, separate them out, our thoughts and feelings, and also used a different way, help us identify triggers. So it's a very valuable worksheet. And it forms one of the foundational tools of cognitive processing therapy. Let's look at, but there are multiple other worksheets that sort of all build. And what I like about cognitive processing therapy, it is a tool set that you actually learn that allows you to move forward in life without a therapist and in a sense become your own therapist. It is a tool that helps you see reality more clearly, your present reality, not the reality of your trauma, which is what most of us with PTSD are living in. We're constantly living in the past. Cognitive processing therapy helps us peel away those layers and see what is really going on, the whole picture. Next slide, please. So some form, this is my belief, of exposure work is usually necessary to heal PTSD. Why is that? Well, prolonged exposure therapy is an intense form of exposure work that's done with a therapist that enables the warrior to desensitize distressing memories and triggers by repeating them in a safe manner until the mind and body realize they are no longer in danger. So the problem we face with post-traumatic stress disorder is the body starts to associate what happened in the traumas with the trauma itself. So a smell, a sight, a sound. And so we walk away with those things warning us that the trauma is going on. And unless we can go back and desensitize those triggers and correct the body and say, wait a minute, that's not actually the trauma. That's just the smell of gasoline. That's not actually the trauma. That's just the desert, or the jungle smell or something like that. Then we're constantly haunted by them. And the other part I talked about is digesting those or processing those memories that we have so adeptly pushed away and hidden behind walls that only start to come out when we are sleeping or worn out or tired or triggered. So those need to be dealt with as well. Otherwise, they're still there. Next slide, please. And EMDR is a therapy endorsed by the VA that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It involves focusing on the event while following the therapist's back and forth hand movement with one eye, simulating the effect of REM sleep in healing. So we know that REM sleep is essential for adjusting our body, putting it back into balance just through our daily interactions. And so this is a therapy that actually sort of tries to simulate that in real life and sort of readjust rebalance the body from the impact of trauma. It may also include other bilateral simulations such as taps and tones, and it may involve keeping a journal or log and is typically done individually. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what family members need to know when a veteran begins trauma processing therapy. Well, the first thing to think about is that increased stress levels in the initial phases of trauma processing therapy sometimes make it appear like PTSD symptoms such as nightmares or irritability or worsening. This is normal as the veteran begin to face the difficult thoughts or feelings he or she has been avoiding. As the veteran continues to work through their trauma, the symptoms typically begin to lessen and hopefully greatly lessen. Next slide, please. One of the therapist's jobs is to challenge the veteran's avoidance while not pushing so hard as to cause a relapse or physical harm to others or self. Next slide, please. So watching for safety flags. Some veterans may revert to unhealthy coping strategies such as drinking or drugs. If they have a history of suicidal tendencies, these can also get triggered. Part of the therapist's job is to assess for these prior to beginning therapy and then monitor throughout therapy. Family support and help can make a big difference though. Next slide, please. How else can family members support a veteran with PTSD? So family members often inspire veterans to seek help and stick with it because, like I said, a lot of veterans, they start, for instance, they might start doing prolonged exposure therapy, and when they reach the session where they have to start to recall the trauma, they they don't come because it becomes too difficult. Becomes too challenging. If they have the support of family members and a therapist sort of encouraging them to understand what is going on, that this is natural, that if you want to go to prolonged exposure therapy, if you're enjoying the process, you probably don't have PTSD and you don't need to be there. So anybody who wants to be in PTSD therapy, probably doesn't, let's put it this way, wants to do prolonged exposure therapy, probably doesn't need it. Nobody wants to do it. It's very challenging and painful, but the benefits can be immense. Next slide, please. Family coping strategy, 4 family coping strategies. So trauma is contagious. When a support person experiences to a lesser degree similar terror, rage, or despair as the victim, vicarious traumatization can occur. And that was by our mother of modern PTSD psychology, Dr. Judith Herman. Next slide, please. So coping strategy number 1, set clear boundaries around safety. So this might include developing a safety plan if violence by the veteran to self or others is a possibility. For example, if violence to a partner due to having a nightmare or a flashback is a possibility, which I've had many vets wake up accidentally hitting their partner or with their hands around their throat or things like that, and not even knowing what's going on. A safety plan might include sleeping in separate bedrooms or having 2 beds a little further apart, separate beds or bedrooms. Next slide, please. Learn all you can about PTSD and available resources. For example, who to turn to if domestic violence or abuse happens. So you should know that that's not a symptom of PTSD. That already has to be there in a person's sort of makeup. But PTSD, certainly when you've got anger, rage, and irritability coming out, when that adrenaline starts pumping, it can exacerbate it. Next slide, please. Here are some resources. I think we can maybe put this up at the end so people can take pictures of it later on if they want, and we'll go back to that at the end so you guys can copy some of the resources. That's for domestic violence, by the way, if you've got any concerns about that. Coping strategy 1C. Give the veteran plenty of space to work things out, especially when they become triggered by reminders. I will add, never say, why don't you just get over it? It's not that simple. It's like telling someone to get over a heart attack. Get over your heart attack. Next slide, please. Family coping strategy number 2A. This goes for both the family members and the veterans. Focus on daily health exercises, basics. Exercise, a minimum of a half hour every day. This is recommended for people with, well, I'm going to go through them first and then go back. Diet, eat healthfully, limit junk foods, reduce stimulants, especially reduce stimulants such as sugar or caffeine. I have done assessments on veterans who come in saying, I can't control my anger. I get angry at everything. And I say, how much coffee do you drink? Oh, I drink 12 cups in the morning. I'm like, well, let's figure out what's going on there, because that might not be PTSD. Anybody who drinks 12 cups. Genetics, of course, being an issue, I can take 1 cup and I'm off the wall, is going to stimulate someone's system. And if they're prone to anger and anxiety, or anxiety, boom, that's what's going to happen. Sleep, make sleep a priority. And practice, can't quite see the bottom part of this slide. Well, anyway, make sleep a priority. I'm not seeing the whole screen, but I'm assuming it's there, but I've got it up here. So hold on 1 second. Okay. And practice good sleep hygiene. Well, easier said than done for veterans, right? Sleeping is sometimes one of the hardest and biggest issues that veterans have. And my own personal theory is that if veterans could just get, or people with PTSD could get good night's sleep on a regular basis, a good number of their symptoms might at least minimize significantly. But this is very important for family members, but especially important for veterans with PTSD or people with PTSD. Why? Because PTSD is an injury to the nervous system that impacts the entire body. That's the difference. A leg is one thing. You get a broken leg. Your nervous system runs, it's your brain, it goes through every fiber. It throws your entire body out of whack. It impacts and in a sense, goes after the weakest parts of our systems, whatever each one of our systems are. So if that adrenaline keeps hitting us and hitting us and hitting us, it wears us down and beats us up. We've got to work on healing the body and the mind and the soul. And it's critical that we start by taking care of our bodies and trying to get it in best shape that it can, so the rest of our self can do what it needs to do to heal. Next slide, please. Work on building healthy relationships and support systems, family members. So if you just focus on your partner with PTSD or your family member with PTSD, you're going to burn yourself out. Make time for your partner, your family, and friends. Learn about relational tools such as timeout. That's very helpful. For instance, that's one tool. That's one of my favorite tools for anger. When things get explosive, I like to just say, let's take a timeout. You agree to that beforehand. And we take a timeout till things cool down, come back. But there are many tools. That's just one. That's one of my favorites. But there are many tools that can be learned and utilized for building healthy relational and support systems. Try not to personalize. People with PTSD are primed to react swiftly to perceived threats, so are likely to lash out before thinking. Remember, it's not about you or even the situation. It's about trauma-related perceptions. So many times when a person with PTSD is getting angry at you, apparently, it's not that they're getting angry at you, it's that their body's being flooded with adrenaline and you happen to be the person there and their body's trying to make sense of it, so they focus on you and boom, the anger comes out. Seeking family, couples, or individual counseling. So I can't see the bottom, so I'm just going to go to my other screen here. Okay. It often helps to have an objective third party listen and provide unbiased support, preferably somebody who has a clue about what's going on with PTSD, because if you don't, and many therapists in the civilian world aren't specially trained, so they don't really understand it. But make sure that when you're seeking out counseling, that you find somebody who really sort of understands this. Next slide, please. Develop at least one outside interest or activity that you engage in regularly. Some of these areas to explore might include hobbies and crafts, arts and music, animal care related activities, spiritual or meditational activities. We have to, as family members, we have to take care of ourselves. That goes with raising kids as well, right? I mean, if you put all your energy into your kids, you burn yourself out. It's a recipe for disaster. And it's the same thing with your partner. If you put all your energy into taking care of your partner, you absorb that energy, and then you need to have other outlets to sort of balance yourself. Next slide, please. So talking about the trauma is an interesting one. Part of what makes a situation traumatic is not talking about it. Talking reduces trauma symptoms. When we don't talk about the trauma, we remain emotionally illiterate. Our most powerful feelings go unnamed and unspoken. Next slide, please. So if you're comfortable talking about their trauma, let them know. And you may not be, and they may not be. Sometimes things are very difficult, but don't pressure them to talk. Let them disclose as much or little as they wish at their own time. And it takes two of you. You have to be ready to hear it, and they have to be ready to talk about it. But it can be very healing if you're able to listen empathetically. And I like to say the key words are without judgment or comparison. And really examine yourself. Can you do this without judging or comparing? No two traumas are exactly alike, and what may be traumatic to one person may not be to another. Next slide, please. So family strategy number 4 is balancing emotional support with tough love. What does this mean? What is tough love? Next slide, please. Emotional support's especially important in the early coping stages of recovery when the veteran is often struggling just to keep it together. During such times, your veteran may have little to give anybody else, their children, relatives, partner, or friends. This can be especially hard on the children who need unconditional love and care. They're not in a position to take care of their parents. So some examples of emotional support, your work phrases. Your work is very appreciated. Let me help you. I understand how stressful this must be. Just take it one step at a time. You can do this. You're an amazing person. Next slide, please. Tough love in the context of PTSD involves encouraging the veteran to fight against his or her tendencies to isolate and disengage from normal social activities. In other words, to avoid. It does not include being anything else. It does not include saying get over it, or you had 8 hours of sleep, what the hell's wrong with you? It means encouraging them to fight against their avoidance. Tough love is most helpful when the veteran is stable and is in the 2nd or 3rd stages of recovery. It's trauma processing and reintegration. It is typically not helpful if they are still in stage 1. Which is coping and stability. Helping your veteran challenge their avoidance may feel uncomfortable, but in the longer run will reduce their anxiety and aid in the recovery. And I might add that when you reach this stage, if you're working with them, you still want to balance it with emotional support, but it's a fine line there. Next slide, please. We've talked about this a little, whether you provide emotional support or use tough love depends on where your veteran is in the recovery process. So how are you going to know that? It's not always clear when to provide emotional support or tough love. So you got to let your veteran be the best judge of where he or she is at. And if they're in therapy, they're going to be challenging that, and the therapist is going to be assessing it, and they'll be able to have a better idea of what they need. Communicate your intent with compassion, caring, and validate your veteran's emotional experience, past and present, to the best of your ability. So some basic steps to validation: acknowledging the other person's feelings, identifying the feelings, offering to listen, helping them label the feelings, not labeling them yourself though, helping them to label them, being there for them, remaining physically and emotionally present, being patient, and being having them feel accepted and non-judgmental. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is my contact information, and I am at 928-899-6475, and/or you can email me at mark.godwin2@va.gov. Shondine Tracy, if you're Navajo, or if you're any Arizona Native American, she would be a great person to contract because she's our acting rural health program coordinator for the Native Americans. And her cell phone is 928-910-3072. That's 928-910-3072. And our PTSD clinical team in Prescott, now we've got other PTSD clinical teams, and I was not able to actually include the Phoenix PTSD clinical team, the Tucson PTSD clinical team. I think Ayla is a member of the PTSD clinical team in Tucson. Is that correct? Yes. So you might hit her up for her contact information after. I don't know. But anyway, next slide. Just some of my selected references. And I think at this point, we can maybe open it up for discussion. Questions, if anybody has any?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Mark. Great discussion and lots of great references here. We did have a couple of people make a few comments. It was just regarding medical cannabis. It's not really relevant to the treatment methods that we were actually discussing today, but if you, Mark, have anything to add to the medical cannabis and how is it used in the VA toolkit in your experience up there up north and across the VA, that'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Okay, so medical cannabis is, as Mr. Pareda states, is absolutely relevant. So the VA stance, and I'm going to sort of talk about cannabis from a couple of different points of view here. What the VA encourages with respect to PTSD is not supporting avoidance, encouraging people to address their traumas. So to that note, drinking and other medications are generally not encouraged, especially if they can be easily abused, because there's a tendency to want to use them to avoid. Now, I am going to give my own personal viewpoint here, which is maybe not 100%. I totally agree with the avoidance part. But there may be instances where, let's put it this way, drinking in and of itself is not bad. It's just bad when it's used for avoidance. Cannabis may not be bad if it's not used to just avoid your symptoms, but if it maybe helps you sleep. I don't know. It's not recommended. You're not going to get prescribed by the VA, but everything needs to be taken into the context of what is going to help you become a healthier, more encourage your recovery and help you cope and deal better. So coping is one thing. Is coping using a drug or alcohol a good thing or a bad thing? If it hurts you biologically, if it gets in the way of your job, if it has adverse impacts that may later on come back and kick you in the butt, such as we learned with smoking cigarettes back in the day, and then cancer. Then it's not maybe such a good thing. If it helps you sleep better and you use it a little bit a certain way or something like that, then maybe it does have a positive impact. So, and as Ricardo, Mr. Pareda has pointed out, there's a couple of drugs that have possibly increased suicidal impact. Well, let's look at that. Medications. Are medications for therapy or for PTSD good or bad? It's the same thing. There's no right or wrong answer. Each person's body is different. Caffeine, for me, caffeine is a freaking nightmare. I take 1 cup of coffee and I'm bouncing off the walls. Other people, 3 cups, and maybe what they need to get going. I don't think you can answer this question. I mean, there's a lot of people who would like to answer them black or white. Yes, cannabis is good, or cannabis is bad, or drinking is good. And I think you have to look at the whole picture. How is it impacting your health in the bigger picture of what you're trying to do when you understand what the disorder is and what your goals are? And then how does that function in the context of where you're going with it? So I think that things like medication, it's a discussion to have with your therapist, with your psychiatrist or nurse practitioner. There's no right or wrong answer that Paxil or Pristiq or Lexapro is or Prazosin is the right drug for you, or cannabis is good or bad, or drinking. If you're a freaking alcoholic, you can't take 1 drink because the next thing you know, you're over the hill. Other people can have a glass of wine at dinner and it relaxes them and it's fine. So to come up with black and white answers to these questions, to me, is just not wise. And I think one I mean, there are some things, okay, heroin addiction, you're screwed. You get stuck on heroin, you're screwed. That's a black and white issue. If you start doing that, you are going to be going down a rabbit's hole that is going to pull you under, that you're going to have a hell of a time getting out. Okay? We could get into the discussion of benzodiazepines. They might be beneficial in certain circumstances, but if you get addicted to them, you're screwed as well, because you're going to have to come off them. So that's stuff that needs to be explored from, once again, the whole perspective, and not just looking at little boxes and going yes or no. And that's a discussion that one needs to have on a broader context. And I don't think this is the place to have it. I think you need to be discussing that with your therapist and your doctors and figure out what is it that you need to move forward, to get better and to feel better in the most helpful way that you can.